The trading post's main room fell silent, except for the storm's relentless assault against the log walls. Francis stood perfectly still, his small frame dwarfed by the towering adults who stared at him with expressions ranging from horror to fascination. His father, Sean's weathered face had gone pale as fresh snow. "Francis, no," Sean whispered, his Irish brogue thick with fear. "Come away from there, son." But the boy didn't move. His bright green eyes, so like his grandmother's, remained fixed on Thunder's ghost, who stood trembling in the doorway between the stable and the main room. The stallion's midnight coat glistened with sweat despite the cold, his nostrils flared wide as he panted in obvious distress. A jagged splinter from the broken stable wall hung from his forelock, and fresh blood streaked down his left shoulder where he'd scraped against the splintered wood. Marcus Thornfield adjusted his expensive coat and smoothed his silver mustache, his grey eyes glittering with cruel amusement. "Well, Murphy," he drawled, loud enough for everyone in the cramped space to hear. "Seems your boy has more backbone than his father, though I suspect that'll change quick enough once Thunder gets a proper look at him." The other travellers trapped by the storm, a Methodist preacher and his wife, 2 miners heading to Helena, and old Henrik the Norwegian trapper, pressed themselves against the far wall. They'd all witnessed what Thunder's ghost could do. Just that morning, the stallion had nearly killed Thornfield's own ranch hand when the man tried to feed him. Francis's mother, Moira, clutched her rosary beads so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "Marcus Thornfield, you devil," she hissed. "He's but a wee child. Call off this madness." "A wager's a wager, Mrs. Murphy," Marcus replied smoothly. "Your boy made the request. I simply accommodated him." He pulled out an ornate silver flask and took a long drink, never taking his eyes off the scene unfolding before him. "Course, if the child's lost his nerve—" Thunder's ghost suddenly reared up on his hind legs, his front hooves pawing the air mere feet from Francis's head. The massive stallion's scream of rage echoed through the trading post, and everyone except the small boy flinched backward. When the horse's hooves crashed down, the floorboards shook beneath their feet. Francis tilted his head slightly, studying the animal with the patient intensity of someone much older. His grandmother Bridget's voice echoed in his memory, soft and lilting as she'd sung to him during the long sea voyage from County Cork. "The old words have power, little one. They speak to the parts of creation that remember when the world was young and unmarked by cruelty." "Siúnas," Francis whispered, the Gaelic word floating through the tense air like a gentle prayer. "Siúnas, mochara dúb. Peace, my black friend." The stallion's ears twitched forward, the first time anyone present had seen him show anything but fury and fear. "I'll be damned," Henrik muttered under his breath. Marcus's confident smirk faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Lucky coincidence," he said, though his voice carried less certainty than before. "Thunder's just deciding which way to trample the boy." Francis took a small step forward, his bare feet silent on the cold floor. His parents had sold his winter boots weeks ago to buy flour, but the boy seemed unbothered by the frigid temperature that had everyone else huddled close to the massive stone fireplace. "Faisim do fian," Francis continued in his soft, clear voice. "I see your pain. Nil igla orm ort, nil michun dosha a dahanam duit. I'm not afraid of you. I won't hurt you." Thunder's ghost lowered his great head, and for a moment his wild eyes focused entirely on the small boy approaching him. The horse's breathing gradually slowed, though his muscles remained coiled with tension. Sean started forward, but Moira caught his arm. "Wait," she breathed. "Look at him, Sean. Really look." There was something different about Francis, something that went beyond his unusual calm in the face of mortal danger. A faint shimmer seemed to surround the boy, barely visible in the firelight, as if he stood at the center of his own pocket of peace in a world gone mad with storm and fury. Marcus Thornfield's flask stopped halfway to his lips. He'd owned Thunder's ghost for 2 years, ever since winning the stallion in a poker game from a broken-down cavalry officer. In all that time, he'd never seen the animal show anything resembling gentleness. The horse was a weapon, valuable precisely because he was unrideable, untouchable, a living symbol of Marcus's power over things that couldn't be conquered. But this Irish immigrant's child was speaking to Thunder's ghost in words that seemed to come from another world entirely, and the stallion was listening. Francis extended one small hand toward the massive horse, palm up in the universal gesture of offering. His grandmother's final gift, the old knowledge passed down through generations of Celtic healers, flowed through him like warm honey. "And bh fuil to wreathe?" he asked softly. "Are you ready?" The trading post held its collective breath as Thunder's ghost lowered his muzzle toward the boy's outstretched hand. The moment stretched like eternity itself. Thunder's ghost's massive head descended slowly, his breath creating clouds of mist that mingled with the boy's smaller puffs in the frigid air. Francis stood perfectly still, his small hand extended with the patience of someone who understood that trust, once broken, required infinite care to rebuild. When the stallion's velvet muzzle finally brushed against his palm, Francis felt the tremor that ran through the great beast's body, not from cold or rage, but from something far deeper. The connection sparked instantly, flooding the boy's mind with images and emotions that weren't his own. Dark stalls, whips cutting through air, the taste of fear and blood, the desperate longing for green fields and gentle hands. "Tui Gim," Francis whispered, tears gathering in his bright green eyes. "I understand." His free hand rose slowly to rest against the stallion's neck, feeling the wild heartbeat gradually steady beneath his touch. The trading post remained frozen in awed silence. Even Marcus Thornfield seemed temporarily stunned, his silver flask forgotten in his manicured hand. But Francis was no longer aware of their audience. In this moment, his world had narrowed to encompass only himself and the magnificent creature before him, a creature who had been broken by cruelty, but was not beyond healing. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. "The gift comes with a price, little one. You'll feel their pain as if it were your own, but you'll also know the joy of mending what others have torn asunder." Through their connection, Francis sensed Thunder's ghost's true nature, not the monster Marcus believed he owned, but a noble spirit driven to madness by abuse and isolation. Before his capture, the stallion had run free across endless Montana grasslands, leading his herd with wisdom and strength. Now he was trapped, caged, beaten into submission by men who saw only profit in his power. "You remember the wind, don't you?" Francis murmured in English now, his voice carrying the same musical cadence as his mother's lullabies. "You remember running with the sun on your back and your family beside you?" Thunder's ghost's dark eyes closed for a moment, and when they opened again, something had shifted. The wild fury remained, but beneath it flickered recognition and hope. Francis became aware of his father approaching cautiously, Sean's weathered hands trembling as he reached toward his son. "Francis, lad, come away now, slowly." But the boy shook his head gently. "He's not ready, Da. He needs to know we won't hurt him." Francis looked up at his father with those unnervingly wise eyes. "He's been hurt so much. Like the mayor in County Cork, remember? The one grandmother helped?" Sean's breath caught. He did remember. His own mother, Bridget Murphy, tending to a horse that had been beaten nearly to death by its owner. She'd spent 3 days sitting in the stall, speaking softly in the old tongue until the animal trusted her enough to accept healing. He'd been about Francis's age then, watching in wonder as his mother worked her inexplicable magic. "You have her gift," Sean whispered, understanding flooding his features. Across the room, Marcus Thornfield's composure began to reassert itself. The cattle baron straightened his expensive coat and took another drink from his flask, though his eyes never left the impossible scene before him. This was not how his evening's entertainment was supposed to unfold. The Irish boy should have been trampled by now, teaching his immigrant family a lesson about knowing their place in the Montana Territory's rigid hierarchy. Instead, Marcus found himself witnessing something that challenged everything he believed about power and control. His greatest symbol of dominance, The untamable stallion that struck fear into every man who saw him was standing docile as a lamb beneath a 4-year-old's touch. Francis felt the stallion's confusion through their connection. Thunder's ghost had expected violence, pain, the sting of leather, or the burn of spurs. Instead, he'd found only gentleness and understanding. The horse's mind struggled to process this kindness, having forgotten that such things could exist. "I know, Mochara," Francis soothed. "It's hard to believe, isn't it? But not all hands bring pain." He began to hum softly, an ancient Irish melody his grandmother had taught him, one that spoke of healing and hope. The sound seemed to wrap around both boy and horse like a protective cocoon. Moira Murphy watched her youngest son with a mixture of pride and terror. She'd seen hints of the gift before, the way stray cats followed Francis home, how injured birds seemed to find their way to him, but nothing like this. Her mother-in-law had tried to prepare her, whispering stories of the old bloodline and its strange blessings, but Moira had always assumed they were just folklore, tales to comfort a homesick woman in a foreign land. Now she understood that Bridget's stories were not myths but inheritance. Thunder's ghost lowered his head further, pressing his forehead gently against Francis's chest. The gesture spoke of surrender, but not defeat, rather the first tentative steps toward trust. Around them, the storm continued to rage, but here in this small circle of warmth and wonder, something beautiful was being born from the ashes of cruelty. The peaceful moment shattered like glass against stone. The trading post's heavy wooden door exploded inward with a thunderous crash, torn from its hinges by the howling wind. Snow and ice blasted through the opening, extinguishing half the oil lamps and plunging the room into flickering shadows. The sudden chaos sent Thunder's ghost rearing backward, his newfound calm dissolving into terror as his hooves struck the air inches from Francis's head. "Easy, Mochara," Francis whispered, his small hand still extended even as the stallion's iron shoes whistled past his face. But the spell was broken. Thunder's ghost wheeled away, his eyes rolling white with renewed panic as he crashed through the doorway back into the stable. Through the gaping entrance came a figure that made even Marcus Thornfield straighten with surprise. Jacob Thornfield stumbled into the trading post, his expensive riding coat torn and bloody, ice crystals frozen in his dark hair. Marcus's younger brother collapsed against the doorframe, gasping for breath as Sean and Henrik rushed to force the damaged door closed against the storm's fury. "Jacob!" Marcus surged forward, his usual composure cracking. "What in hell are you doing here? You should be safe in Helena." Jacob's wild eyes found his brother across the room. The Blackfeet," he panted, his voice hoarse from shouting over the wind. "They've left the reservation, Marcus. War party, maybe 30 braves. They're moving this way, following the old buffalo trails." He sagged against the wall, exhaustion and terror written across his pale features. "They burned out the Henderson place yesterday. Killed the whole family." The trading post fell into stunned silence. Even the storm seemed to quiet for a moment, as if the very mountains were holding their breath. Old Henrik crossed himself. Sweet Jesus, in this weather? They must be desperate indeed. "They're tracking the army patrol that killed their chief's son last month," Jacob continued, accepting a cup of coffee from the preacher's wife with shaking hands. "But the soldiers made it to Fort Benton. The war party. They're looking for any white settlement now, any target for their grief." Moira Murphy pulled Francis close, her maternal instincts overriding her amazement at what she'd just witnessed. "How far?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 6, maybe 8 miles, Jacob replied grimly. "But this storm's slowing them same as it slowed me. We might have until dawn, if we're lucky." Marcus Thornfield's mind was already racing, calculating odds and advantages with the cold precision that had built his cattle empire. "The trading post's defensible," he said. "Stone walls, good shooting positions. We have, what, 7 men who can handle firearms?" 5, corrected Henrik. "The preacher don't hold with violence, and Sean Murphy's got no weapon." "I can fight," Sean said quietly, his Irish pride flaring despite their circumstances. "With what?" Marcus's voice carried its usual contempt. "Your bare hands." It was then that Francis stepped forward, his small voice cutting through the adult tension like a blade. "Thunder's ghost could help us." Every eye in the room turned to the boy. His parents stared at him in shock, while Marcus let out a harsh laugh. "Child, that horse is trapped in a damaged stable and mad with fear. He's more likely to kill us all than help anyone." But Francis shook his head with that unsettling certainty that seemed far too mature for his 4 years. "He's not mad. He's hurt and angry, but he's not mad. He could carry messages or help people escape if the fighting goes bad." "Francis," his mother said gently, "the horse won't let anyone ride him. He's too wild." "He's not wild," Francis insisted, his green eyes bright with conviction. "He just doesn't trust people anymore. But I could ask him to help. In the old words, he might listen to me." Marcus stared at the small boy with a mixture of disbelief and something that might have been hope. He'd built his fortune on calculated risks, and right now Thunder's ghost represented their only advantage. If the stallion could somehow be controlled, the horse was worth more than money. In the hands of someone who could ride him, he could mean the difference between life and death for everyone trapped in this isolated trading post. "You're suggesting," Marcus said slowly, "that you could tame him in one night?" Francis considered this seriously. "Not tame him. Ask him. There's a difference." He looked toward the stable where they could hear Thunder's ghost pacing restlessly, the sound of his hooves mixing with the storm's fury. "But I'd have to touch him again. Stay with him. Help him remember that not everyone wants to hurt him." The choice hung in the air like smoke. Outside, a war party was approaching through the blizzard, driven by grief and rage. Inside, a 4-year-old boy was offering to risk his life communicating with a creature that had nearly killed grown men. Sean Murphy looked at his youngest son, this strange, gifted child who carried his grandmother's ancient wisdom, and felt the weight of decision settle on his shoulders like a shroud. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled only by the storm's relentless howling and the distant sound of Thunder's ghost's restless pacing. Sean Murphy felt the eyes of every person in the trading post boring into him, waiting for his decision. His youngest son stood before him, small and earnest, offering to walk into the jaws of death as casually as he might offer to fetch water from the well. "No." The word tore from Sean's throat like a physical thing. "Absolutely not, Francis. I won't have my boy torn apart by that devil horse." Francis's green eyes, so much like his grandmother Bridget's, remained steady and unblinking. "But Da, he's not a devil, he's just—" "I said no!" Sean's voice cracked with the strain of it. He'd already buried 2 children in the hard Montana ground, little Mary to the fever 2 winters past, and baby Thomas who'd never drawn a proper breath. The thought of losing Francis, his strange, gifted boy who carried the old blood so strongly, was more than his heart could bear. Moira stepped closer to her husband, her own fear written plainly across her pale features. "Sean's right, Mo Store," she whispered to Francis. "You're just a wee lad. This isn't your burden to carry." But even as she spoke the words, Moira felt the terrible weight of their situation pressing down upon her. Through the damaged door she could hear the storm beginning to weaken, its fury gradually spent. When dawn came, they would be trapped like rabbits in a warren, with nowhere to run and precious little to fight with. Marcus Thornfield's calculating gaze moved between father and son, weighing possibilities with the cold precision of a man who'd built his fortune on other people's desperation. "The boy's our only chance of controlling that stallion," he said quietly. "Thunder's ghost is the fastest horse in the territory. With him we could send riders for help or evacuate the women and children if—" "You'd sacrifice a child for your damned horse?" Sean's fists clenched at his sides, Irish temper flaring despite their circumstances. "I'd use every advantage we have to keep us all alive," Marcus replied evenly. "Including your son's unusual gift." Francis felt the fear radiating from his parents like heat from a forge. Through the connection he'd shared with Thunder's ghost, he still carried echoes of the stallion's memories. The pain of beatings, the terror of confinement, the desperate longing for freedom. But beneath those dark images lay something else, the horse's fundamental nobility, his fierce desire to protect those he considered family. "He wants to help," Francis said softly, his small voice barely audible over the adult's argument. Thunder's ghost. He remembers leading his herd, keeping them safe from wolves and storms. He wants to be that again, a protector, not a prisoner. Old Henrik shifted uncomfortably by the fire. Even if the lad's right about the horse, it's madness to put a child in such danger. One wrong move, one moment of the beast reverting to his wild nature. The unspoken words hung heavy in the air. They'd all seen what Thunder's ghost's hooves and teeth could do to a man. The memory of Marcus's ranch hand, broken and bleeding in the stable that morning, was fresh in everyone's mind. Francis looked around the room at the frightened faces, the preacher's wife clutching her Bible, the miners fingering their pistols nervously, Jacob Thornfield still pale with exhaustion and terror. These people needed hope, needed something to believe in besides their own imminent destruction. But the weight of their expectations felt enormous, crushing down on his small shoulders like a physical burden. What if he was wrong? What if the connection he'd felt with the stallion was just wishful thinking, a child's imagination spinning fairy tales in the face of harsh reality? What if Thunder's ghost turned on him the moment he stepped into that stable, reverting to the traumatized beast that everyone else saw? His grandmother's voice whispered in his memory, "The gift is not without cost, little one." Sometimes the burden of healing others' pain will feel too heavy for your heart to carry, but remember, courage is not the absence of fear, it's choosing to do what's right despite the fear. Francis closed his eyes, reaching out with senses beyond the physical, feeling for Thunder's ghost's presence in the stable. The stallion's emotional state washed over him, confusion, anger, and underneath it all, a bone-deep loneliness that made the boy's chest tighten with sympathy. When he opened his eyes again, his parents were staring at him with a mixture of love and terror that made his heart ache. They would forbid this, he realized. They would choose his safety over everyone else's survival, because that's what parents did. They protected their children, even when the cost might be catastrophic. Outside, the storm's voice was definitely weakening. Dawn and the war party drew steadily closer. Francis took a deep breath that seemed too large for his small chest, then stepped away from his parents' protective embrace. The movement was small, barely 2 steps toward the stable door, but it carried the weight of a chasm crossed. In that moment, the 4-year-old boy left behind the safe harbor of childhood and entered waters dark and deep with consequence. "I have to go to him," Francis said quietly, his voice carrying a certainty that silenced the room's protests before they could form. Not because of the warriors, or because Mr. Thornfield wants his horse tamed, because Thunder's ghost is calling for help, and I'm the only one who can hear him. Sean lunged forward, desperation making his movements clumsy. "Francis, no! I forbid it!" But the boy was already moving toward the stable, with purpose that seemed to flow from somewhere beyond his years. "You told me once that a man's worth isn't measured by what he takes from the world, but by what he gives back." Francis paused at the threshold, his hand on the damaged stable door. Thunder's ghost has only known taking, beatings, chains, loneliness. Someone has to show him giving. Moira's sob cut through the air like a blade. "You're just a baby, Francis. This isn't your responsibility." Francis turned back to his mother, and for a heartbeat, she saw not her youngest child, but the ghost of her mother-in-law, Bridget, the same otherworldly wisdom, the same terrible compassion that had driven the old woman to heal every broken creature that crossed her path. "Grandmother always said the gift chooses when to be used, ma'am. It's choosing now." The stable door creaked open under his small hand, releasing a wave of hay-scented air mixed with the musk of fear and fury. Thunder's ghost's presence hit Francis like a physical force, raw emotion and pain radiating from the magnificent creature in waves that made the boy's knees buckle momentarily. So much anger, Francis thought, steadying himself against the doorframe. So much hurt. Marcus Thornfield stepped forward, his calculating mind still wrestling with the impossibility of what he was witnessing. "Boy, if you're determined to do this madness, at least let me—" Francis's refusal was gentle but absolute. "He knows your touch, Mr. Thornfield. He knows your anger. If you come with me, he'll remember only pain." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Marcus's jaw tightened as he recognized the truth in the child's words. Every interaction he'd had with Thunder's ghost had been about dominance, about breaking the stallion's will through force and intimidation. The boy was right. His presence would poison any chance of reaching the traumatized animal. Francis crossed the threshold into the stable, leaving behind the warm light and human voices of the trading post. Here, in the dim space lit only by a single oil lamp, the world narrowed to encompass only himself and the creature that waited in the shadows. Thunder's ghost stood in the far corner of his makeshift stall, his black coat gleaming with sweat despite the cold. His dark eyes rolled white as Francis approached, and his hooves stamped nervous rhythms against the wooden floor. The stallion's breathing came in harsh, rapid bursts that spoke of barely controlled panic. "Da me ansio," Francis whispered in the old tongue. "I am here. I know you're frightened. I know you don't understand why I came back when everyone else only brings pain." The boy settled cross-legged on the stable floor, making himself as small and non-threatening as possible. This close, he could feel Thunder's ghost's confusion like a physical weight. The stallion's mind was a storm of conflicting impulses, the urge to flee warring with the memory of gentle hands, the expectation of violence clashing with the strange peace this small human had offered. Behind him, Francis could hear his parents' whispered argument with the others, their voices tight with fear and helpless love. His father was demanding to follow him into the stable, while Henrik and Marcus argued about defensive positions and ammunition counts. But their voices seemed to come from another world now, distant and fading. "I'm not going back," Francis murmured, more to himself than to the horse. "Not until you know you're safe, not until you remember what it feels like to trust." Thunder's ghost snorted, a sound caught between aggression and uncertainty. The stallion took a hesitant step forward, then froze as if surprised by his own movement. In the lamplight, Francis could see the scars that marred the animal's powerful frame, marks left by spurs, whips, and chains. Each scar told a story of cruelty, of a magnificent spirit slowly broken by men who saw only profit in his power. "They hurt you because they were afraid," Francis said softly, extending his hand palm up in invitation. "Afraid of your strength, your wildness, everything they couldn't control. But I'm not afraid of what you are, Mochara. I'm only afraid of what they've made you forget." The stable fell silent except for the sound of breathing, human and equine, and the gradually diminishing voice of the storm outside. Somewhere in the distance, dawn was approaching, carrying with it unknown dangers. But here, in this small circle of lamplight, a boy and a horse stood at the edge of trust, poised to leap together into faith. The stallion's massive head lowered slowly toward Francis's outstretched palm, breath misting in the cold air between them. For one heartbeat, too, the entire world seemed to balance on this moment of potential connection. Then Thunder's ghost's nostrils flared as he caught an unfamiliar scent, and he jerked back with a sharp whinny that echoed through the stable like a gunshot. Francis remained perfectly still, though his heart hammered against his ribs. Through their tenuous connection, he felt what had spooked the horse, the acrid smell of gunpowder and fear drifting from the trading post, carried by the shifting wind. Thunder's ghost's memories flooded through the link, cavalry soldiers firing over his head, the sharp crack of rifles during his capture, the smell of blood and smoke that always preceded violence. "Tasiadig la orthu," Francis whispered. "They are afraid, but not of you, Astor. They fear what's coming with the dawn." The stable door creaked behind them, and both boy and horse tensed. Henrik's weathered face appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "Lad," he called softly, "your father's beside himself with worry, and we need to know, can the horse be ridden or not? We've spotted campfires to the north. They're closer than we hoped." Thunder's ghost's ears pinned back at the sound of the old man's voice, and Francis felt the stallion's hard-won calm beginning to fracture. "Please," the boy said urgently to Henrik, "don't come any closer. He's starting to trust, but it's fragile as spider silk." Henrik hesitated, torn between his need for information and his recognition of what was happening in that dim stall. "How much time do you need, boy?" Francis looked into Thunder's ghost's dark eyes, seeing layers of trauma that ran deeper than physical scars. "I don't know. He's been hurt for so long he's forgotten how to believe in kindness." As if to prove the point, voices rose sharply from the trading post behind Henrik. Marcus Thornfield's commanding tone cut through the walls. "We can't wait for miracles. We need to barricade the windows and distribute ammunition now." Thunder's ghost's head snapped up at the sound of his owner's voice, and Francis felt a wave of bitter rage flow through their connection. In the stallion's memory, that voice meant whips and spurs, meant being driven past exhaustion for the entertainment of Marcus's wealthy friends. The horse's muscles bunched as if preparing to charge, and Francis quickly placed both hands against the wooden barrier between them. "He's not here to hurt you," Francis said desperately. "I won't let anyone hurt you again, I promise." But even as he spoke the words, Francis knew how hollow they must sound. What power did a 4-year-old boy have against men like Marcus Thornfield? What protection could he offer to a creature whose value lay precisely in his subjugation? Henrik withdrew from the doorway, but his departure brought no relief. Through the gaps in the stable walls, Francis could see the first pale hints of dawn creeping across the sky. Somewhere in the distance, 30 Blackfeet warriors were moving through the dying storm, their hearts heavy with grief and rage. Time was running out like sand through his small fingers. "And bh fuil tu raid le du la baile," Francis whispered, using words his grandmother had taught him. "Are you ready to go home? Not to Mr. Thornfield's ranch, but to the place inside your heart where you remember running free with the wind in your mane." Something shifted in Thunder's ghost's posture. The stallion's ears swiveled forward, and Francis caught a flash of memory through their bond. Vast Montana grasslands, a herd of wild horses racing across endless prairies, the pure joy of unrestrained movement. For just a moment, the pain and anger faded, replaced by something that might have been longing. But the moment shattered as Jacob Thornfield's voice carried from the trading post, "They're moving again! I can see riders through the trees." The fear in the man's voice was like acid on Thunder's ghost's wounds. The stallion reared suddenly, his hooves striking the stall walls with thunderous impacts that made Francis scramble backward. Through their connection, the boy felt the horse's terror, not of the approaching warriors, but of being trapped, confined, unable to flee when violence came calling. Francis pressed himself against the stable wall, his small body trembling with the effort of maintaining their link, while Thunder's ghost's panic threatened to overwhelm them both. This was the test Henrik had warned him about, not whether he could touch the horse, but whether he could hold onto that connection when fear tried to tear it apart. "Time ansio," he gasped, fighting against the tide of the stallion's emotions. "I am here. We can be afraid together, but we don't have to be afraid alone." Through the stable walls came the sound of rifles being loaded, of furniture being dragged to barricade windows. Dawn was breaking over Copper Creek, and with it would come the moment of truth for everyone sheltering in the trading post. But in the stable, a boy and a horse clung to their fragile bond like castaways clinging to driftwood in a storm-tossed sea. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, punctuated by the sharp crack of breaking branches as the war party moved through the forest. Francis felt Thunder's ghost's terror spike through their connection, a primal fear that went beyond the present danger to something deeper, older. In the stallion's fractured memories, the boy glimpsed flashes of that terrible day, cavalry soldiers surrounding the wild herd, ropes whistling through the air, the screams of mares separated from their foals forever. "They took everything from you," Francis whispered, his small voice barely audible over the chaos erupting in the trading post. "Your family, your freedom, even your name. They called you Thunder's ghost because they killed the thunder inside you." The stallion's massive frame shuddered, and for a moment Francis thought their fragile bond might snap entirely under the weight of shared anguish. But instead of pulling away, Thunder's ghost lowered his great head until his muzzle nearly touched the boy's outstretched palm. The gesture was tentative, testing, like a wild creature approaching a water source that might be poisoned. Behind them, the trading post exploded into frantic activity. Francis heard his father's voice raised in desperate argument. "I won't leave my son in there if those warriors break through." "The boy's our only hope of reaching that horse," Marcus Thornfield interrupted, his voice cold with calculation. "If Francis can calm him enough to ride, Thunder's ghost could carry news of our situation to Fort Benton. The cavalry could be here by—" "You'd risk a child's life for your own skin?" Sean's Irish accent thickened with rage. "That's my boy in there, not some pawn in your schemes." Francis closed his eyes, trying to block out the human fears and focus on the creature before him. Through their connection, he felt Thunder's ghost processing the raised voices, categorizing threats, preparing for the violence that had defined his existence since capture. But underneath the fear and rage, something else stirred. A flicker of the stallion's original nature, the part of him that had once led his herd with wisdom and courage. "You were a leader once," Francis murmured, his grandmother's Gaelic words flowing like a prayer. "Shenair Nagapol, leader of horses. You protected the weak, guided the lost, stood between your family and danger. That horse still lives inside you, doesn't he?" Thunder's ghost's dark eyes fixed on the boy's face with startling intensity. For a heartbeat, Francis felt himself falling into those depths, experiencing the stallion's memories, not as an observer, but as a participant. He ran across endless grasslands, felt the wind singing through his mane, knew the fierce joy of protecting creatures who depended on his strength and wisdom. But the vision shattered as gunshots erupted from the forest, not the disciplined volleys of soldiers, but the scattered firing of desperate men making their last stand. Through the stable walls came shouts in a language Francis didn't recognize, followed by Marcus Thornfield's voice bellowing orders. "Hold your fire until they're in range. We can't waste ammunition." Thunder's ghost reared again, his hooves striking the stall walls with enough force to shake the entire structure. Francis scrambled backward as splinters rained down around him, but he refused to break eye contact with the terrified animal. In that moment, he understood something his grandmother had tried to teach him. Sometimes healing required accepting pain, holding steady while the wounded creature thrashed against its bonds. "Timid, imbaul le shale," Francis gasped as the stallion's panic crashed over him in waves. "We are in danger together. But you're not trapped anymore. You're choosing to stay, choosing to fight beside those who need you. That makes you free, not caged." The distinction seemed to penetrate Thunder's ghost's terror-clouded mind. The stallion's wild thrashing slowed, replaced by a different kind of tension, not the helpless fury of a captive beast, but the coiled readiness of a warrior preparing for battle. Through their bond, Francis felt the change like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. From the trading post came the sound of breaking glass as someone smashed out a window for a better firing position. Moira's voice rose above the chaos, raw with maternal anguish. "Francis Mostor, come back to us!" The boy's heart clenched at his mother's call, but he remained motionless, one hand extended toward Thunder's ghost's trembling muzzle. This was the moment of absolute choice, the point where trust either took root or withered forever. All around them, violence was erupting as two groups of traumatized, desperate people prepared to destroy each other. But here, in this small circle of lamplight, healing remained possible. "Touch me," Francis whispered, his grandmother's words flowing through him like ancient music. "Bain Domsa, Argus Bisar, touch me, and be free." Thunder's ghost's nostrils flared as he caught the boy's scent, not the harsh smell of fear and dominance that had defined his world, but something else entirely, something that spoke of home fires and gentle hands, of songs sung in a language older than conquest. Slowly, carefully, The stallion's muzzle descended toward Francis's palm. The velvet softness of Thunder's ghost's muzzle brushed against Francis's palm like a whispered prayer answered. In that instant of contact, the boy felt the stallion's entire world crash into his consciousness, not gradually this time, but all at once, a torrent of memory and emotion so powerful it drove him to his knees on the stable floor. Pain, whips cracking across flanks, spurs raking bloody furrows, the iron taste of bits forced between teeth. Loss, the desperate calls of his herd fading into distance as ropes dragged him away from everything he'd ever known. Rage, years of fighting against chains and stalls and the crushing weight of human cruelty. But underneath it all, Francis found something else, hope. A tiny flame that had somehow survived every attempt to extinguish it, hidden so deep within Thunder's ghost's spirit that perhaps even the stallion had forgotten its existence. The stable door burst open behind them. "Francis!" Sean Murphy's voice cracked with terror as he saw his son collapsed on the floor, one small hand pressed against the massive horse's lowered head. "Get away from him!" Thunder's ghost's muscles tensed, his ears flattening as the familiar surge of protective aggression rose within him. But this time, something different happened. Instead of rearing away from the perceived threat, the stallion stepped closer to Francis, his great body forming a shield between the boy and the doorway. Through their connection, Francis felt the stallion's confusion at his own actions. Why protect the small human? Why not flee? But deeper than confusion ran something Thunder's ghost hadn't experienced in years: purpose. For the first time since his capture, he had chosen to guard rather than simply survive. "It's all right, Da," Francis whispered, though his voice trembled with the effort of containing Thunder's ghost's overwhelming emotions. "He's not going to hurt me. He's remembering what he was before they broke him." More voices erupted from the trading post. Marcus Thornfield shouting orders about defensive positions, Moira crying for her son, the sharp reports of rifles echoing through the forest as the war party drew closer. Each sound was a blow against the fragile peace Francis and Thunder's ghost had built, threatening to shatter their bond and send the stallion back into mindless terror. But Francis refused to let go. His small hand pressed more firmly against Thunder's ghost's muzzle, and he poured every ounce of his grandmother's teachings into that touch. "Tadu thaglach mab, ach is fedir li teglach nua afail," he whispered in the ancient tongue. "Your family is dead. You can find a new family." The words hit Thunder's ghost like lightning. Through their connection, Francis felt the stallion's memories shift and blur, the faces of his lost herd transforming into the desperate humans huddled in the trading post. Moira's tears for her endangered children, Sean's fierce determination to protect his family, even Marcus Thornfield's cold calculation born from his own terror of losing everything he'd built. They were all herd creatures, Francis realized, all of them driven by the same ancient need to protect their own, to stand together against the darkness that sought to destroy them. "You can choose," Francis said, his young voice carrying a weight far beyond his years. "You can let the pain win, or you can be the leader you were born to be. They need you, Thunder's ghost. They need your strength, your speed, your courage." Outside the stable, the sounds of conflict grew closer. Francis heard Marcus Thornfield's voice rise above the chaos. "Henrik, take 3 men and cover the north wall. Jacob, help me with these ammunition boxes. If they break through our perimeter—" The sentence was cut short by a war cry that seemed to shake the very foundations of the trading post. Through the stable walls came the thunder of galloping hooves, the whistle of arrows, and the desperate shouts of men fighting for their lives. Thunder's ghost reared up on his hind legs, but this time it wasn't panic that drove him, it was rage. The same protective fury that had once made him charge bears threatening his herd now blazed in his dark eyes as he heard the sounds of battle. These humans might not be his blood, but they had sheltered the small one who had shown him kindness. They had given him warmth when he expected only cold chains. Francis scrambled to his feet, his hand still maintaining contact with the stallion's neck. Through their bond, he felt Thunder's ghost's transformation completing itself, from broken captive to guardian, from victim to warrior. "Yes," Francis breathed, tears streaming down his cheeks as he witnessed the magnificent creature's rebirth. "This is who you truly are. This is what they could never take from you." Thunder's ghost lowered his head until his forehead pressed against Francis's chest, and in that gesture the boy felt the stallion's complete acceptance. Not submission, acceptance. The horse was choosing his path, choosing his battles, choosing his family. The stable walls shook as something heavy struck them from outside. Through the gaps in the wood, Francis glimpsed painted faces and drawn bows, heard his mother's scream cut through the morning air like a blade. Thunder's ghost's eyes blazed with ancient fire as he turned toward the sounds of battle. Every muscle in his powerful frame coiled for action. The ordeal had truly begun. Thunder's ghost exploded into motion like a force of nature unleashed. The stallion's massive shoulder slammed into the stable door, splintering the ancient wood as if it were kindling. Francis stumbled backward as their connection suddenly blazed with the horse's warrior fury, a primal rage that had been dormant for years, but now burned like wildfire through every fiber of the great beast's being. "Wait!" Francis cried, scrambling after the charging stallion. "Don't leave me!" But Thunder's ghost was beyond hearing human words. Through their bond, Francis felt the horse's consciousness fracturing under the weight of too much stimulation. The screams of battle, the scent of blood, the overwhelming need to protect warring against years of learned helplessness. The careful healing they'd built together was disintegrating like morning mist before a hurricane. The stallion burst from the stable into chaos. Warriors on painted ponies wheeled around the trading post, their arrows finding gaps between hastily erected barricades. Francis saw his father pressed against a window, rifle in hand, his face white with terror. Moira crouched behind an overturned table, clutching baby Patrick while tears streamed down her cheeks. Thunder's ghost reared high, his wild scream cutting through the battle sounds like a blade. For one magnificent moment, he was every inch the leader he'd once been, 16 hands of raw power and ancient fury. But as his hooves struck earth, Francis felt their connection snap like a broken rope. "No!" The boy ran after the stallion, his small legs pumping desperately. Through the chaos, he caught glimpses of Thunder's ghost's eyes, and saw nothing there he recognized. The trust they'd built, the fragile bond that had promised healing, was gone. In its place was only the wild madness of a creature pushed beyond its breaking point. A Blackfeet warrior wheeled his pony toward the loose stallion, perhaps seeing an opportunity to claim such a magnificent prize. Thunder's ghost spun to face this new threat, but instead of the calculated response of a herd leader, Francis felt only confusion and panic radiating from the horse's mind. The warrior raised his war club, and Thunder's ghost, confused, terrified, stripped of the boy's calming presence, did what broken things always did. He ran. The stallion bolted toward the forest, crashing through underbrush like a creature possessed. Francis stumbled after him, his small voice lost in the cacophony of battle. "Come back! Please come back!" But Thunder's ghost was already disappearing into the trees, taking with him any hope of escape for the people trapped in the trading post. Francis collapsed to his knees in the mud, feeling the last threads of their connection dissolve into nothing. All his grandmother's teachings, all his patient work, all the love he'd poured into healing the stallion's wounded spirit, gone in an instant, undone by the very violence they'd hoped to escape. Behind him, his father's rifle cracked repeatedly. Marcus Thornfield's voice rose in desperate command. "They've got us surrounded. Save your ammunition. Make every shot count." Francis turned toward the trading post, and through the broken doorway saw something that made his small heart freeze. Jacob Thornfield lay motionless beside an overturned barrel, an arrow protruding from his chest. Moira was no longer behind her barricade. Francis caught a glimpse of her being dragged away by painted warriors, baby Patrick screaming in her arms. "Ma'am!" Francis shrieked, lurching to his feet. but before he could run toward the trading post, strong hands seized him from behind. The Blackfeet warrior was young, his face painted with symbols of mourning and revenge. He spoke words Francis couldn't understand, but the boy felt the man's grief and rage as clearly as if they shared the same bond he'd forged with Thunder's ghost. This warrior had lost someone precious too, a wife perhaps, or a child, and now sought to balance the scales of sorrow. Francis was lifted onto the warrior's pony, his small body shaking with shock and despair. As they rode away from the burning trading post, he looked back to see his father still fighting desperately at a window, unaware that his family was already lost. Marcus Thornfield emerged from the building with his hands raised in surrender, his arrogant confidence finally shattered. But worst of all, Francis caught one last glimpse of Thunder's ghost at the edge of the forest. The stallion had stopped running and turned back toward the trading post, as if some part of him remembered what he was supposed to protect. For a heartbeat, their eyes met across the distance, and Francis felt an echo of their broken bond, a whisper of recognition, of regret. Then the trees swallowed the stallion from view, and Francis was carried away into captivity, leaving behind the smoking ruins of everything he'd tried to save. The bond was broken, his family scattered, and Thunder's ghost had fled back into the wilderness of his own wounded soul. The boy who had promised to heal what cruelty had broken now faced the crushing truth. Sometimes love wasn't enough. Sometimes innocence only made the darkness hurt more. The Blackfeet camp sprawled along a frozen creek bed like a collection of ghosts made manifest in the pre-dawn darkness. Francis had stopped shivering hours ago, not from warmth, but from a numbness that had settled into his bones and spirit alike. He sat beside a dying fire, his small hands bound with rawhide strips, watching shadows dance across painted lodge skins while the weight of his failures pressed down like stones. 3 days had passed since the raid, 3 days of silence broken only by the keening of mourning women and the low conversations of warriors planning their next strike. Francis understood none of their words, but grief spoke a language older than tribes or treaties. These people had lost someone precious, just as he had lost everything. The young warrior who had captured him, whose name Francis had learned was Running Wolf, sat across the fire, sharpening an arrow point with methodical precision. His painted face remained impassive, but Francis could sense the man's sorrow like a physical presence. Through the terrible gift that had once connected him to Thunder's ghost, the boy felt echoes of Running Wolf's memories. A woman's laughter cut short by cavalry sabers, children's voices silenced by winter hunger and broken promises. "We're the same," Francis realized with a sudden clarity that sometimes comes in moments of absolute despair. "We've all lost what we loved most." But even as understanding flickered to life in his young mind, a new sound reached his ears, distant but unmistakable. Hoofbeats. Not the measured pace of camp ponies or the organized thunder of cavalry charges, but something wilder, something desperate. Running Wolf's head snapped up, his warrior instincts immediately alert. Other figures emerged from lodges, weapons appearing in their hands with practiced silence. The sound grew closer, a single horse moving through the forest at breakneck speed, crashing through underbrush with the reckless abandon of a creature beyond reason. Francis felt his heart stop as recognition crashed over him. He knew that gait, knew the rhythm of those hoofbeats like his own pulse. "Thunder's ghost," he whispered, the name barely a breath in the cold air. The stallion burst from the tree line like an apparition of vengeance. His black coat gleamed silver with sweat, despite the frigid air, his eyes wild with the same madness that had driven him from the trading post. But this wasn't the random flight of a panicked animal. This was purpose incarnate, terrible and magnificent. Thunder's ghost had come for him. The warriors raised their weapons, but the stallion moved like liquid lightning, weaving between their thrown spears with supernatural grace. Francis felt their old connection spark back to life. Fragile at first, then stronger, like a flame rekindled from dying embers. Through the bond, he experienced Thunder's ghost's desperate journey, 3 days of following the war party's trail, driven by an anguish that matched the boy's own. He came back, Francis thought with wonder that bordered on reverence. He broke free, but he came back. But the revelation that truly shattered Francis's understanding came when Thunder's ghost's memories flooded through their renewed connection. Not just the journey to find him, but everything that had happened after the Stallion's flight from the trading post. Francis saw through the horse's eyes as Thunder's ghost had returned to find the trading post in flames, saw his desperate search through the ruins for any trace of the small human who had shown him kindness. And in those memories, Francis discovered the truth that changed everything. His family wasn't dead. Thunder's ghost had seen them, Sean Murphy and the surviving members of both families, being led away as captives by a different band of warriors. They were alive, somewhere in the vast wilderness, prisoners just as Francis was a prisoner. The Stallion had tracked both groups, torn between his need to protect them all, until finally choosing to rescue the one who had healed his broken spirit. They're alive, Francis thought, tears streaming down his cheeks as the impossible hope bloomed in his chest. Da, Mam, little Patrick, they're all alive. But with this revelation came another understanding, one that struck him with the force of divine inspiration. Thunder's ghost hadn't just come to rescue him. The Stallion had come because he finally understood what Francis had been trying to teach him. Love wasn't about possession or dominance. It wasn't about chains or conquering or bending others to your will. Love was about choice. The choice to return when you could run free. The choice to fight for others when you could save only yourself. The choice to trust again after betrayal, to hope again after loss, to heal again after breaking. Thunder's ghost skidded to a halt beside the fire, his great head lowering to nuzzle Francis's bound hands. Through their connection, the boy felt the Stallion's complete transformation, not back to what he had been before his capture, but into something entirely new, a creature who had chosen his own path, his own purpose, his own family. As Running Wolf slowly approached with his knife drawn, whether to free Francis's bonds or cut the boy's throat, Francis couldn't tell. The child looked into Thunder's ghost's dark eyes and saw his own future reflected there. They were going to save everyone, together. Running Wolf's knife gleamed in the firelight as he stepped closer, and Francis felt Thunder's ghost's muscles coil beneath his sweat-darkened hide. Through their restored bond, the boy sensed the Stallion's readiness to fight, to kill if necessary, to protect the small human who had shown him what healing meant. But Francis also felt something else flowing through their connection. His grandmother's ancient wisdom whispered in Gaelic words that carried the weight of generations. Na Deen Dioltas, Deen Siochain, he breathed, the words meant for Thunder's ghost but spoken loud enough for Running Wolf to hear. Don't make vengeance, make peace. The Stallion's head turned slightly, dark eyes fixed on Francis with an intelligence that bordered on human. Through their bond, the boy poured everything he'd learned in these 3 days of captivity, the weight of Running Wolf's grief, the shared understanding of loss, the terrible cycle that turned victims into victimizers and healing into hatred. Running Wolf stopped mid-stride, his painted face showing the first crack of uncertainty. He spoke in his own tongue, words that Francis couldn't understand but recognized as a question. The warrior's knife remained raised, but his grip had shifted from offensive to defensive. Francis looked up at Running Wolf, seeing past the war paint to the broken soul beneath. Your family, he said softly, knowing the man likely didn't understand English, but hoping the tone would carry meaning. They were taken too, just like mine. Something in Francis's voice, some quality that transcended language barriers, made Running Wolf lower his weapon slightly. The warrior's eyes moved between the bound child and the magnificent Stallion who had charged through an armed camp to reach him, and Francis felt the exact moment when understanding dawned. Thunder's ghost took a careful step forward, his massive head extending toward Running Wolf in the same gesture of tentative trust he'd once shown Francis in the stable. The stallion's nostrils flared, reading the warrior's scent, his emotional state, the depth of his pain. Through their connection, Francis felt Thunder's ghost recognizing something familiar in this man, the scent of someone who had lost his herd, his family, his reason for living. Running Wolf's knife trembled in his hand. He spoke again, and this time Francis heard the question mark in his tone, even without understanding the words. The warrior was asking something. Perhaps why the horse had come, perhaps why a 4-year-old boy looked at him with such knowing compassion. "He came back because love is stronger than fear," Francis said, his small voice carrying across the hushed camp where other warriors and women had gathered to witness this impossible scene. "And you can choose to break the chain." Thunder's ghost lowered his great head until his muzzle nearly touched Running Wolf's chest, just as he had done with Francis in that miraculous moment of first connection. The stallion's breath misted in the cold air, and Francis felt the horse deliberately opening himself to this new contact, offering his own scarred spirit as proof that healing was possible even after the worst damage. Running Wolf's knife clattered to the ground. The warrior's free hand rose with infinite slowness until his palm pressed against Thunder's ghost's forehead, and Francis felt the shock of recognition that passed between them. Two broken souls, meeting in a moment of perfect understanding. Running Wolf's painted face crumpled, years of suppressed grief finally finding release as he leaned into the stallion's strength. Through Thunder's ghost, Francis felt the warrior's memories flowing, not just of loss, but of the man he'd been before tragedy hardened his heart. A father, a husband, a protector who had once gentled wild horses with patience rather than force. The war paint and weapons were armor against unbearable pain, but beneath them lived someone who understood exactly what Francis was trying to accomplish. "Tanaist," Francis whispered, using the Gaelic word his grandmother had taught him for a chosen leader, a successor born of merit rather than blood. He looked at Running Wolf with new eyes, seeing not just another grieving man but a potential ally. "You know horses. You know what it means when one chooses to trust again." Running Wolf straightened slowly, his hand still resting on Thunder's ghost's neck. When he spoke this time, his voice was different, softer, weighted with something Francis recognized as hope. The warrior turned to the other members of his band who had gathered around the fire, and Francis felt the shift in the camp's energy as Running Wolf began to speak. The boy couldn't understand the words, but he felt their impact through Thunder's ghost's heightened senses. Running Wolf was telling them about choice, about the stallion who had charged through armed warriors to reach a captured child, about the possibility that strength could serve something greater than revenge. When Running Wolf knelt beside Francis and began cutting his bonds, the boy felt tears streaming down his cheeks. Not tears of relief, but of recognition. They weren't just planning an escape anymore, they were building something larger. An alliance between broken spirits who had chosen healing over hatred. Thunder's ghost nickered softly, and through their bond, Francis felt the stallion's complete understanding. They had found their first ally in an impossible place, and together they were going to save everyone who could still be saved. The real plan was finally beginning. As Running Wolf's knife severed the last of his bonds, Francis felt the circulation returning to his wrists like fire through his veins. But the physical sensation paled beside the weight of what he now understood. This moment was the point of no return. Everything that had brought him here, every choice that had led to Thunder's ghost's capture and escape, to the raid and his family's imprisonment, had been preparing him for what came next. He looked around the Blackfeet camp with new eyes, seeing not just his captors but potential allies in a rescue that would require more courage than any 4-year-old should possess. Through Thunder's ghost, he felt the stallion's memories of where the other captives had been taken. A winter camp 3 days' ride to the north, heavily defended, where his father and the Thornfield survivors were likely being held as bargaining chips in negotiations that might never come. Running Wolf stood slowly, his weathered hand still resting on Thunder's ghost's neck. When he spoke to his gathered people, Francis caught fragments of meaning through tone and gesture. The warrior was asking them to make an impossible choice, to help rescue the very people they had taken as prisoners, to break the cycle of retribution that had defined their recent raids. An older woman stepped forward, her face lined with the kind of sorrow that had settled into permanent creases. She spoke sharply to Running Wolf, and though Francis couldn't understand her words, he felt the challenge in them. Thunder's ghost's ears flicked nervously, sensing the tension that rippled through the camp like wind across water. Francis climbed slowly to his feet, his legs shaking from 3 days of limited movement. But when he placed his small hand on Thunder's ghost's shoulder, the stallion's strength flowed through him like a river. "She lost someone too," he said quietly to Running Wolf, looking at the woman with the same compassion he'd shown the warrior. "They all did." Running Wolf nodded grimly, then spoke to the woman in a tone that carried both respect and gentle insistence. Francis felt the moment when the conversation shifted, when Running Wolf began describing not just what Thunder's ghost had done, but what it meant. The stallion had chosen to return for a human child, crossing enemy territory and facing armed warriors because love had proven stronger than the instinct for self-preservation. The woman's expression began to soften as Running Wolf continued, and Francis suddenly understood what the warrior was truly proposing. This wasn't just about rescuing the captives, it was about proving that another way was possible, that strength could serve healing instead of revenge, that the cycle of violence could be broken by those brave enough to make the first gesture toward peace. Thunder's ghost shifted beneath Francis's touch, and through their bond, the boy felt the stallion's growing urgency. The other captives were alive for now, but winter was deepening, and desperation made even honorable warriors capable of terrible choices. Time was running short, and every day they delayed meant greater danger for Sean Murphy, Moira, baby Patrick, and whoever else had survived the trading post raid. But Francis also felt something else through their connection, Thunder's ghost's absolute confidence in him. The stallion had made his choice, had thrown his lot in completely with this small human who carried such impossible wisdom. Whatever came next, they would face it together, and the horse's faith in that partnership was unshakable. A younger warrior spoke up from the edge of the gathering, his voice carrying the heat of fresh anger. Francis sensed the challenge in his words, the argument that helping their former enemies went against everything their recent losses demanded. Other voices joined in, some supporting Running Wolf's proposal, others arguing for the traditional path of continued warfare. Francis felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge, felt how easily it could tip toward failure and blood. The consequences of every choice he'd made since approaching Thunder's ghost in Marcus Thornfield's stable seemed to press down on him like stones. His childish belief that love could heal anything, that innocence could bridge the gaps between sworn enemies, hung in the balance as adult voices debated in words he couldn't understand. Then, Thunder's ghost made the choice for all of them. The stallion stepped forward into the center of the arguing circle, his massive presence immediately commanding attention. Francis felt what the horse was doing through their bond, offering himself as proof of what was possible. Thunder's ghost had been broken by cruelty, driven to violence by years of abuse and captivity. Every person in this camp could see the scars on his hide, could recognize the marks of a creature that had every reason to hate humans. Yet here he stood, calm and trusting, having chosen to return for a human child when he could have run free. The argument wasn't about politics or tribal loyalty anymore. It was about whether they would follow the example of a horse who had learned to choose healing over hatred. Running Wolf met Francis's eyes across Thunder's ghost's neck, and in that look the boy saw complete understanding. The warrior knew what they were truly attempting. Not just a rescue, but a transformation of everything that had brought them to this moment of violence and loss. The final confrontation wasn't just approaching, it was beginning right here, in the choice between the old ways and something entirely new. Thunder's ghost's hooves struck the frozen ground with deliberate precision as he moved to the exact center of the firelight, his black coat rippling with muscle and determination. Francis felt the stallion's purpose flow through their bond. This was no longer about waiting for others to choose. This was about demonstrating what courage looked like when it served something greater than revenge. The arguing voices fell silent, As Thunder's ghost lowered his massive head toward the young warrior who had spoken against helping the captives, Francis held his breath, feeling through their connection the stallion's careful assessment of this man's pain, fresh grief, raw anger, the kind of fury that demanded blood to balance blood. But instead of challenge or threat, Thunder's ghost offered the same gesture he had given Francis in that first moment of trust, an invitation to touch, to understand, to heal. The young warrior stepped back instinctively, his hand moving toward his weapon. Francis felt the entire camp watching, felt the weight of generations pressing down on this single moment. Everything depended on whether this angry young man could see past his grief to something larger. "Tabron Orm," Francis whispered, the Gaelic words for sorrow carrying across the hushed circle. "Tabron Orm Faoi do Chaiteanas. I'm sorry for your loss." The young warrior's eyes snapped to Francis, confusion replacing anger. Through Thunder's ghost's heightened senses, the boy felt the exact moment when the man recognized something impossible. A 4-year-old white child speaking words of sympathy in an ancient tongue, offering condolence with a sincerity that transcended language barriers. Running Wolf stepped forward, his voice low but carrying clearly as he spoke to the younger man. Francis couldn't understand the words, but he felt their impact through the stallion's awareness of shifting emotional currents. Running Wolf was telling the story, not just of Thunder's ghost's return, but of what the horse represented, a creature who had chosen healing over hatred, trust over vengeance, love over fear. The young warrior's hand trembled as he reached toward Thunder's ghost's extended muzzle. The moment of contact sent a shock through Francis that he felt in his bones. Another connection forged, another heart opened to the possibility that strength could serve something greater than destruction. But even as this victory unfolded, Francis felt Thunder's ghost's growing urgency. Through their bond came images of the northern winter camp, memories of his family's faces, the knowledge that every moment of delay brought greater danger to those they needed to save. Time was their enemy now, as much as fear or hatred. The older woman who had first challenged Running Wolf moved closer to the fire, her weathered features softened by whatever she saw in the interaction between horse and warrior. She spoke to Francis directly, her tone gentle despite the language barrier, and though he couldn't understand her words, he felt their meaning through Thunder's ghost's interpretation of her emotions. "You are very young to carry such weight." Francis looked up at her, seeing in her lined face the same grief he'd recognized in Running Wolf, in the young warrior, in everyone who had lost family to this endless cycle of raid and retaliation. "We can break it," he said simply, his small voice carrying absolute conviction. "All of us together, we can choose something different." Thunder's ghost lifted his great head, and Francis felt the stallion's complete agreement flowing through their bond. This was what they had been building toward, not just an escape, but a transformation. The horse had learned that true strength meant choosing to trust again after betrayal, to love again after loss. Now he was teaching that same lesson to an entire camp of broken souls. Running Wolf began speaking again, his words flowing faster now with growing excitement. Francis felt the shift through Thunder's ghost as the warrior outlined a plan, not just for rescuing the captives, but for something larger, a gesture that might begin healing wounds that had festered for generations. The young warrior nodded slowly, his hand still resting on Thunder's ghost's neck. Others stepped forward, men and women who had lost family, friends, hope itself to the endless cycle of violence. Each touch, each moment of connection with the stallion who had chosen healing, added another voice to the growing consensus. Francis felt tears streaming down his cheeks as the impossible began to seem inevitable. They were going to attempt something that had never been tried, a rescue mission that might transform enemies into allies, that might prove love truly could conquer the deepest hatred. Thunder's ghost turned his head toward Francis, dark eyes reflecting firelight and something deeper, absolute faith in the boy who had first shown him what healing meant. Through their bond flowed the Stallion's complete commitment to whatever came next, his trust that together they could face any challenge. The circle of faces around the fire had changed, Francis realized. These were no longer his captors, but his partners in an impossible endeavor. The final test wasn't just beginning, it was already transforming everyone it touched. They would ride north at dawn, all of them together, carrying hope instead of weapons into the heart of winter. The winter camp materialized through the pre-dawn darkness, like a fortress of shadows and smoke, and Francis felt his courage falter for the first time since Thunder's ghost had carried him into the impossible. Perched behind Running Wolf on the Stallion's broad back, the boy could see through their bond what Thunder's ghost remembered: the layout of lodges, the positioning of guards, the terrible knowledge of where the captives were being held. But memory was nothing compared to the reality that greeted them as they crested the final ridge. The camp below sprawled across a protected valley, its fires casting dancing shadows that made accurate counting impossible. Francis felt Thunder's ghost's muscles tense beneath him as the Stallion registered the scent of fear, desperation, and something darker, the smell of violence preparing to unfold. "Too many," whispered one of Running Wolf's warriors in broken English, his words barely audible above the wind. "Too many guards. Too many angry hearts seeking blood." Francis closed his eyes and reached deeper into his connection with Thunder's ghost, seeking the knowledge they needed. Through the Stallion's extraordinary senses came fragments of understanding, his father's voice, weak but alive, coming from a lodge near the camp center, baby Patrick's cries, thin with hunger and cold, Moira's whispered prayers in the Gaelic his grandmother had taught her. But underneath these precious confirmations of life came something that made Francis's blood turn to ice. Thunder's ghost could smell the preparations for execution, the sharpened blades, the gathering of witnesses, the terrible ritual that would begin with sunrise. They hadn't arrived in time to prevent tragedy, they had arrived just as it was about to unfold. "They're going to kill them this morning," Francis said, his small voice cutting through the hushed conference of warriors. "We're too late for careful plans." Running Wolf's hand tightened on Thunder's ghost's reins as he absorbed this information. Francis felt the warriors struggle through their shared connection to the Stallion, the choice between wisdom that counseled retreat and love that demanded immediate action no matter the cost. Then Marcus Thornfield's voice rose from the camp below, and Francis felt Thunder's ghost's entire body go rigid with recognition and rage. The cattle baron's words carried clearly on the winter air, arrogant and demanding even in captivity, threatening his captors with retribution that would never come. But underneath the bluster, Francis heard something else, fear so deep it had transformed into desperate cruelty. "He's making it worse," Francis breathed, understanding flooding through him as Thunder's ghost's memories provided context. "He's threatening them, making demands. They're going to start with him." The Stallion's response was immediate and decisive. Thunder's ghost stepped forward, out of the concealment of the ridge, his massive form silhouetted against the lightening sky. Francis felt the horse's absolute refusal to hide, while those who had shown him kindness faced death below. This was Thunder's ghost's confrontation too, his chance to prove that the healing Francis had given him could be passed forward, could save others as it had saved him. "What are you doing?" Running Wolf hissed, but Francis was already sliding from the Stallion's back, his small hands finding their familiar position on Thunder's ghost's neck. "What we came to do," the boy replied, and through their bond flowed perfect understanding. They would go down together, all of them, but not as raiders or rescuers. They would go as proof that another way was possible, that enemies could choose to become allies, that the cycle of violence could be broken by those brave enough to risk everything for love. Thunder's ghost began his descent toward the camp, each step deliberate and measured. Francis walked beside him, his tiny form dwarfed by the massive horse, but somehow drawing strength from their connection that made him seem larger than his 4 years. Behind them came Running Wolf and the others, no longer a war party but something entirely new. protectors carrying hope instead of weapons into the heart of hatred. The first shouts of alarm rose from the camp as sentries spotted their approach, but Thunder's ghost didn't break stride. Francis felt the stallion's absolute faith in what they were attempting, his trust that the healing which had begun in a Montana stable could transform even this moment of ultimate confrontation. As they reached the edge of the camp, Francis saw his father's face appear in the opening of a guarded lodge, gaunt with captivity but alive, his eyes widening with impossible recognition as he saw his 4-year-old son walking calmly beside the black stallion that had started everything. Warriors poured from lodges around them, weapons raised, voices raised in challenge and confusion. This was the moment, Francis realized, the final test of everything they believed about love's power over fear. Thunder's ghost stepped into the center of the hostile circle, and Francis felt the stallion's absolute readiness for whatever came next. The confrontation they had been building toward, since that first moment of connection in Marcus Thornfield's stable, had finally arrived, and together they would face it with hearts open to either transformation or tragedy, the sacrifice. The circle of warriors tightened around them, like a noose, their weapons glinting in the firelight as Thunder's ghost stood motionless at the center of their rage. Francis felt the stallion's heartbeat against his palm, steady, unafraid, completely trusting in the boy whose touch had first shown him that healing was possible. But through their bond came something else now, something that made Francis' breath catch in his throat with sudden, terrible understanding. Thunder's ghost was prepared to die for this moment. The knowledge flowed between them like water finding its level, the stallion's absolute certainty that his life was a fair trade for the lives of those who had shown him kindness. Francis felt Thunder's ghost's memories, Sean Murphy's gentle hands cleaning his wounds, Moira's soft voice singing Irish lullabies while she brought him fresh water, even baby Patrick's innocent laughter echoing from the trading post. They had given him back his capacity to trust, and now he would give them back their freedom, no matter the cost. "No," Francis whispered, his small hands gripping the stallion's neck as the circle of warriors grew smaller, their voices rising in angry debate about what to do with this impossible intrusion. That's not how healing works. That's not what love means. But Thunder's ghost's resolve was unshakable. Through their connection, Francis felt the horse's plan unfold, how his death would serve as proof of the bond between them, how his sacrifice would force both sides to see the cost of their hatred. The stallion believed his blood would be the price that purchased peace, that sometimes love required the ultimate offering. The war chief emerged from the largest lodge, his painted face hard as winter stone. Francis recognized him from Thunder's ghost's memories, Wounded Bear, a man whose grief had transformed into something sharp enough to cut the world. The chief's eyes fixed on the stallion with a mixture of recognition and fury that made the other warriors step back instinctively. "The horse that brought our enemies to us," Wounded Bear said, his English heavily accented but clear enough. "The black devil that started this war. You come to die where you belong." Francis stepped between the chief and Thunder's ghost, his small form dwarfed by the massive stallion but somehow drawing strength from their connection that made him seem larger than his 4 years. "He came to heal what was broken," the boy said, his voice carrying clearly despite its youth. "We all did." The chief's hand moved to his tomahawk, but something in Francis's tone made him pause. Through Thunder's ghost's heightened senses, the boy felt the exact moment when Wounded Bear recognized the impossible, a white child speaking of healing while standing calmly in a hostile camp, protected only by a horse that should have been wild with fear. "The horse brought death to our people," Wounded Bear said, but Francis heard the uncertainty beneath the anger. "Blood calls for blood. Blood calls for healing," Francis replied, and placed both hands on Thunder's ghost's neck. The stallion's warmth flowed through him, carrying with it the memory of their first connection, the moment when touch had spoken louder than words, when compassion had proven stronger than fear. "Show them," he whispered in Gaelic. "Te spein doib an firin. Show them the truth." Thunder's ghost lowered his great head toward Wounded Bear's outstretched weapon, offering his throat with the same trust he had shown Francis in that Montana stable. But this time, Francis felt something different flowing through their bond, not resignation but invitation. The stallion wasn't asking for death, he was asking for understanding. The war chief's tomahawk trembled in his grip as Thunder's ghost's muzzle touched the cold metal. Francis felt the moment when Wounded Bear recognized what he was seeing, not the wild devil of his nightmares, but a creature capable of perfect trust, offering himself not in defeat, but in hope that love might prove stronger than hatred. "He's not afraid to die," Francis said softly, his young voice carrying across the silent camp. "But he'd rather live to help us all heal. That's what courage really means, choosing to trust even when it might cost everything." The tomahawk fell from Wounded Bear's numb fingers, clattering against the frozen ground with a sound that seemed to shatter more than just the morning silence. Francis felt the exact moment when the chief's grief began its transformation from sharp-edged fury into something deeper, the recognition that his pain had been shared, that others had lost just as much and chosen differently. Through Thunder's ghost came the sensation of the entire camp holding its breath, waiting to see what would emerge from this moment of perfect vulnerability. The stallion's sacrifice hadn't been his death, it had been his willingness to trust completely, to offer everything he was to the possibility that enemies could become allies. Francis felt tears streaming down his cheeks as he understood the true cost of what they had accomplished. Victory hadn't required Thunder's ghost to die. It had required him to risk dying for love, to prove that healing was worth any price. And in that offering, the horse had shown everyone watching what real strength looked like. The circle of warriors began to lower their weapons as the stallion's courage worked its quiet magic on hearts that had forgotten anything but anger. Francis felt the moment when transformation became inevitable, when Thunder's ghost's sacrifice of safety for trust became the foundation for something entirely new, the resolution. The silence that followed stretched like a held breath across the winter camp, broken only by the soft sound of Francis's tears falling onto Thunder's ghost's neck. The boy felt the stallion's profound exhaustion flowing through their bond, not physical weariness, but the deep tiredness that comes after risking everything and discovering that survival was possible after all. Wounded Bear stood motionless, staring at his fallen tomahawk as if seeing it for the first time. Francis watched the war chief's face transform, the hard lines of anger softening into something raw and unguarded. Through Thunder's ghost's heightened awareness, the boy felt the exact moment when the chief's rage finally broke apart, revealing the ocean of grief that had been feeding it all along. "My son," Wounded Bear whispered, his voice barely audible. "My boy was only 7 winters, the same age as—" His eyes found Francis, and the recognition that passed between them needed no translation. Loss speaking to loss, father's heart to father's heart. Francis heard movement from the lodge, where his own father was being held, Sean's voice calling out in desperate hope. "Francis? Mo Mac, is that truly you?" The Irish endearment carried across the camp like a prayer answered, and Francis felt Thunder's ghost's joy as the stallion recognized the voice of the man who'd first shown him gentleness. "He's here, Papa," Francis called back, his small voice steady despite the tears. "We're all here to take you home." Running Wolf stepped forward from where he had been standing with his warriors, his weathered face creased with something between amazement and disbelief. He spoke to Wounded Bear in their shared language, his words flowing like water over stones, and Francis felt through Thunder's ghost the meaning underneath, a request not for victory, but for grace. The war chief nodded slowly, then looked directly at Francis. "You would take them all, even the loud one who threatens our children with soldiers who will never come?" Francis understood he meant Marcus Thornfield, whose voice had fallen silent from whatever lodge held him. The boy pressed his face against Thunder's ghost's warm neck, seeking guidance through their connection. The stallion's response came not in images, but in feeling, the memory of every kindness shown, every moment when love had chosen to expand rather than contract. "Everyone," Francis said firmly. Healing doesn't get to pick and choose who deserves it. Wounded Bear's mouth quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile. He bent to retrieve his tomahawk, and Francis felt several warriors tense, but the chief simply slid the weapon into his belt with a gesture that seemed to close the door on something that could never be reopened. "The Black Horse," Wounded Bear said, approaching Thunder's ghost with careful respect. "He carries strong medicine we have forgotten." The stallion allowed the war chief's touch, and Francis felt the moment of contact like an electric shock through their bond. Wounded Bear's eyes widened as Thunder's ghost shared what he chose to share. Not words, but the pure sensation of choosing trust over fear, healing over hatred. The chief's hand trembled against the stallion's neck. "Wakan," Wounded Bear breathed, "sacred." Orders began flowing in the Lakota tongue as the war chief organized the release of the captives. Francis heard his father's voice again, stronger now, speaking to someone Francis couldn't see. "Careful with the baby now. Little Patrick's been through enough." Thunder's ghost shifted beneath Francis's hands, and through their bond came the stallion's urgent awareness of the rising sun. Dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, and with it came the knowledge that this fragile peace needed action to become permanent. Sean Murphy emerged from his lodge, supported by one of Running Wolf's warriors, his face gaunt from captivity, but his eyes blazing with fierce joy as he saw his youngest son. "Francis Mosroy, how did you—" He stopped, seeing Thunder's ghost, seeing the circle of warriors with lowered weapons, seeing the impossible made manifest. "The horse brought us together, Papa," Francis said simply. "All of us." Moira appeared next, carrying baby Patrick wrapped in furs, her face streaked with tears of relief. The infant's cries had stopped, replaced by the wondering silence of someone too young to understand danger, but old enough to sense when it had passed. Marcus Thornfield was the last to emerge, flanked by two stern warriors who released him with obvious reluctance. The cattle baron's face was a map of confusion and wounded pride, his eyes moving between Francis, Thunder's ghost, and the peaceful scene that his mind seemed unable to process. "I don't understand," Thornfield said, his voice hoarse. "They were going to kill us. Why would they—" "Because someone chose differently," Francis interrupted, his small hand still resting on Thunder's ghost's neck. "Someone decided that love was stronger than hate." The stallion raised his head, morning sunlight catching the intelligent darkness of his eyes, and Francis felt their shared understanding flow between them like water finding its course. They had done what they came to do, not through violence or cunning, but through the simple, revolutionary act of refusing to let hatred have the final word. The journey home could begin. The journey back to Copper Creek trading post unfolded like a dream wrapped in winter silence, but Francis felt every moment of it with an intensity that seemed to burn the experience into his very bones. Thunder's ghost moved beneath him with the fluid grace of water finding its course, but the stallion's stride carried something new now, a deep contentment that flowed through their bond like warm honey. Francis's father rode beside them on one of Running Wolf's horses, his gaunt frame slowly straightening as miles passed, and the reality of freedom settled into his bones. Sean's eyes never strayed far from his youngest son, as if afraid this miracle might dissolve like morning mist. 4 years old, he murmured periodically, shaking his head. 4 years old, and you've done what grown men couldn't manage. But Francis felt different now, changed in ways that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with understanding. The gift his grandmother had whispered about in Gaelic lullabies wasn't just about touching wounded animals. It was about recognizing that healing required the healer to be transformed as much as the healed. Through Thunder's ghost, he had learned that true strength meant choosing vulnerability, that real courage looked like a stallion offering his throat to an enemy's blade because love was worth any risk. Moira rode ahead with baby Patrick, her voice lifted in an Irish melody that danced on the winter air. The infant's delighted babbling provided counterpoint to his mother's song, and Francis felt Thunder's ghost's deep pleasure in the sound. The stallion had learned to associate human voices with kindness instead of cruelty, and each note of Moira's lullaby seemed to strengthen that new knowledge. Marcus Thornfield rode in sullen silence at the rear of their small procession, flanked by two of Running Wolf's warriors, who had volunteered to escort them safely to the trading post. The cattle baron's face remained a storm of confusion and wounded pride, his eyes occasionally fixing on Francis with an expression caught between disbelief and something that might have been reluctant respect. "I still don't understand how this happened," Thornfield said finally, his voice carrying across the crystalline air. "A child and a horse, and suddenly everything changes?" Francis felt Thunder's ghost's response through their bond. Not anger at the man who had caused so much pain, but a kind of patient sadness for someone who still couldn't see beyond the surface of things. "Nothing sudden about it, Mr. Thornfield," the boy replied, his small voice carrying clearly. "It started the moment someone first hurt Thunder's ghost. Every choice after that was just deciding whether to make the hurt bigger or smaller." Sean's hand moved instinctively toward his son, a protective gesture that spoke of his wonder at the wisdom emerging from such a young soul. "Francis, a store," he said softly. "What happened to you out there? You're different somehow." The boy considered this as Thunder's ghost's hooves found their rhythm in the snow. Different. Yes, that felt right. Not older exactly, but wider somehow, as if his heart had learned to hold more than it had before. "I think maybe I found out what grandmother's stories really meant," he said finally, "about the old country and the people who could speak to animals. It wasn't magic, Papa. It was just choosing to listen." Through Thunder's ghost came the stallion's deep agreement, along with images of all the moments when listening had made the difference. Francis hearing the pain beneath the rage, Wounded Bear hearing the truth beneath the surface, even Thornfield beginning to hear something beyond his own wounded pride. As the familiar outline of Copper Creek Trading Post emerged from the white landscape ahead, Francis felt a bittersweet tug in his chest. Home meant safety, meant warmth and his own bed and his mother's cooking. But it also meant the end of this strange, terrible, wonderful journey that had taught him who he really was. Thunder's ghost sensed his emotions and turned his great head slightly, one dark eye meeting Francis's gaze. Through their bond flowed perfect understanding. This wasn't an ending but a beginning. The healing they had discovered together wouldn't stay trapped in memory. It would grow and spread like ripples on still water, touching every life they encountered. Old Henrik emerged from the trading post at the sound of approaching horses, his weathered face transforming from wariness to amazement as he recognized the impossible procession. "Mother of God," he breathed, his accent thick with emotion. The boy, the horse, they actually did it. Francis slid down from Thunder's ghost's back as they reached the post, his small hands maintaining contact with the stallion's neck. He was the same 4-year-old boy who had walked into that stable days ago, but he was also something more now, a bridge between worlds, a proof that healing was always possible for those brave enough to risk everything for love. The reunion had begun, but Francis knew the real journey was just starting. The warmth of the trading post enveloped them like a mother's embrace, but Francis found himself reluctant to step fully inside, his small hand still resting on Thunder's ghost's neck in the doorway. The stallion's presence had become as necessary to him as breathing, and the thought of separation, even temporary, sent anxiety rippling through their bond. "The horse can't come inside, Momac," Sean said gently, understanding his son's hesitation. "Henrik's already done more than enough, letting us stable him here." "He won't run," Francis said with absolute certainty. "He knows we belong together now." And it was true. As Francis finally stepped across the threshold, Thunder's ghost settled himself just outside, his dark eyes visible through the frost-covered window. The stallion's contentment flowed through their connection like a steady heartbeat, patient and sure. The trading post buzzed with quiet activity as the rescued families settled in. Moira had claimed a corner near the fire, unwrapping baby Patrick with tears of relief streaming down her cheeks. The infant, safe and warm, gurgled with delight at the dancing flames. Sean lowered himself into a chair with the careful movements of a man still recovering from captivity, but his eyes never left his family, as if memorizing every detail. Henrik bustled about, pressing hot coffee into adult hands and warm milk into Francis's small ones. 3 days, the old trader kept muttering in amazement. 3 days you were gone, and I thought, Herregud, I thought I'd sent a child to his death. You sent me to Thunder's ghost, Francis corrected softly, and he needed me as much as I needed him. Marcus Thornfield stood apart from the celebration, his massive frame somehow diminished in the warm light of the trading post. He watched the Murphy family reunion with an expression Francis couldn't quite read, part longing, part confusion, all of it wrapped in the kind of loneliness that came from building walls so high you forgot how to tear them down. "The wager," Thornfield said suddenly, his voice cutting through the gentle murmur of conversation. "You touched the stallion. You actually did it." Francis felt every adult eye in the room turn toward them, felt the weight of promises made in anger and pride. Through the window, Thunder's ghost's ears pricked forward, the stallion somehow sensing the importance of this moment without hearing the words. "I remember," Francis said simply. Thornfield's hands shook as he pulled a folded document from his coat pocket, the deed to his ranch, prepared in the arrogant certainty that no child could accomplish the impossible. "This belongs to you now," he said, offering the paper to Francis with something that might have been relief. "The Thornfield Ranch, all of it." Francis looked at the deed, then at Thunder's ghost's patient form beyond the window, then back at the broken man before him. The boy's heart, expanded by everything he had learned about healing and choice, suddenly understood what needed to happen. "I don't want your ranch, Mr. Thornfield," Francis said quietly. "I want something else instead." "Francis," Sean warned softly, but his son raised a small hand. "Thunder's ghost taught me that healing means everybody gets to start over," the boy continued, his young voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had looked into the heart of pain and chosen love instead. "Keep your land, but promise me something. Promise you'll learn to listen the way Thunder's ghost taught me to listen. To your horses, to your workers, to the people you meet who might need kindness instead of hardness." Thornfield stared at the child before him, and Francis felt the exact moment when understanding broke over the cattle baron like sunrise over mountains. The man's knees buckled and he sank into a chair, the deed crumpling in his trembling hands. "A 4-year-old child," Thornfield whispered, "teaching me what my 60 years never could." He looked up at Francis with eyes bright with unshed tears. "You would forgive everything after what I put your family through?" "Thunder's ghost forgave everything," Francis replied, moving to the window where the stallion's warm breath fogged the glass. "He taught me that holding on to hurt just makes it grow bigger, and we're all too tired for any more hurt." Months passed like pages turning in a book written by hope itself. Spring came early to Montana Territory that year, as if the land itself had decided that healing deserved sunshine and new grass. Francis grew, not just in size, but in the quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who he was and what he was meant to do. Thunder's ghost thrived in the meadow behind the trading post that Henrik had gifted to the Murphy family. The stallion's coat gleamed like polished obsidian in the mountain light, but it was the peace in his dark eyes that marked the real transformation. Other horses came to him, broken animals that their owners brought from miles around, drawn by stories of the boy who could heal with touch and whispered Gaelic words. Francis never charged for his gift. Instead, he asked each person the same question Thunder's ghost had taught him: "Are you ready to choose love over fear?" Some said yes immediately, others needed time. But all of them left changed, carrying with them the knowledge that healing was always possible for those brave enough to begin. On warm evenings, Francis would sit in the meadow with Thunder's ghost's great head resting in his lap, watching the sun paint the mountains gold while his family's laughter drifted from their new cabin. In those moments, connected to the stallion who had taught him that love could transform anything, the boy understood that some journeys never truly end. They just grow wider, touching more hearts, healing more wounds, proving again and again that courage looked like a child's hand reaching toward a frightened animal with nothing but trust and hope. The gift his grandmother had whispered about in Gaelic lullabies lived on, rippling outward like water finding its way to the sea, carrying the promise that no heart was too broken to be made whole again.